Ancient Egyptian medicine was a sophisticated system that combined practical medical knowledge with religious beliefs and magical practices. Egyptian physicians were highly regarded throughout the ancient world and developed treatments for a wide variety of ailments using both natural remedies and surgical procedures. Medical practice was closely connected to temple worship and religious rituals that were believed essential for healing. Egyptian medical education was conducted in temple schools where students learned both practical healing techniques and the religious ceremonies that accompanied medical treatment. Medical knowledge was preserved in papyrus scrolls that contained detailed descriptions of diseases, symptoms, and treatments. These medical texts were considered sacred and were carefully guarded by temple priests who controlled access to medical knowledge. Ancient Egyptian diagnostic methods were surprisingly advanced for their time and included careful observation of symptoms, examination of bodily functions, and assessment of the patient's overall condition. Physicians checked pulse rates, examined urine and feces, and observed skin color and texture to determine the nature of illnesses. They understood that different diseases produced characteristic symptoms that could be used to identify specific conditions. Egyptian anatomical knowledge was extensive due to their practice of mummification, which required detailed understanding of internal organs and body structure. Embalmers and physicians worked closely together and shared knowledge about anatomy and physiology. This practical experience with human bodies gave Egyptian doctors advantages over physicians in other ancient cultures who had limited understanding of internal anatomy. Ancient Egyptian surgical procedures were performed with bronze and copper instruments that were carefully crafted for specific medical purposes. Egyptian surgeons could set broken bones, remove tumors, perform cataract surgery, and treat various wounds and injuries. Surgical instruments included knives, forceps, probes, and needles that were designed for particular operations and were kept sharp and clean. Egyptian wound treatment involved cleaning injuries with water and wine, applying various medicinal substances, and bandaging with linen strips. Physicians understood the importance of keeping wounds clean to prevent infection. Although they did not understand the scientific reasons behind this practice, they used honey as an antiseptic because they observed that it helped prevent wound infections. Ancient Egyptian dental care was relatively advanced compared to other ancient cultures. Egyptian dentists could extract teeth, treat abscesses, and repair damaged teeth using gold wire and other materials. Dental problems were common due to the gritty bread that wore down teeth, and many mummies show evidence of severe dental disease. Wealthy Egyptians sometimes had artificial teeth made from ivory or gold. Egyptian pharmacology utilized hundreds of different substances derived from plants, animals, and minerals. Common medicinal plants included willow bark for pain relief, garlic for infections, and poppy for sleep disorders. Animal products like honey, milk, and various fats were used as bases for medicines. Mineral substances included salt, natron, and various colored earths that were believed to have healing properties. Ancient Egyptian medical specialization developed as physicians focused on treating particular types of conditions or working with specific patient populations. Some doctors specialized in eye diseases, others in digestive disorders, and still others in women's health issues. Palace physicians treated only royal family members and high government officials, while temple physicians served the general population and trained new doctors. Egyptian medical records were kept on papyrus scrolls that documented patient symptoms, treatments prescribed, and outcomes of medical interventions. These records helped physicians track the progress of diseases and evaluate the effectiveness of different treatments. Medical records also served as teaching materials for training new physicians and preserving medical knowledge for future generations. Ancient Egyptian public health measures included regulations for food preparation, water quality, and waste disposal that helped prevent the spread of disease. Temple physicians inspected markets to ensure food safety and quality. Public latrines were built in cities to improve sanitation. However, many people lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions that facilitated the spread of infectious diseases. Egyptian obstetrics and gynecology were well-developed medical specialties that addressed the health needs of women during pregnancy, childbirth, and other reproductive health issues. Midwives were trained to assist during difficult births and to recognize complications that required medical intervention. Contraceptive methods were known and used, though their effectiveness was limited by available technology. Ancient Egyptian mental health treatment recognized that emotional and psychological problems could cause physical symptoms and required specialized care. Physicians understood that grief, fear, and anger could affect physical health and prescribed treatments that addressed both mental and physical aspects of illness. Religious ceremonies and temple rituals were often prescribed as treatments for mental health problems. Egyptian epidemic disease control involved quarantine measures, religious ceremonies, and public health interventions during outbreaks of infectious diseases. Physicians recognized that some diseases spread from person to person and recommended isolation of affected individuals. Temple ceremonies were performed to appease gods who were believed to send diseases as punishment for wrongdoing. Ancient Egyptian veterinary medicine was practiced by specialists who treated animals used for agriculture, transportation, and religious ceremonies. Veterinary physicians understood animal anatomy and could treat injuries and diseases in cattle, horses, dogs, and other animals. Animal health was considered important for both economic and religious reasons, and sick animals received careful attention. Egyptian medical ethics required physicians to do their best to help patients and to avoid causing harm through inappropriate treatments. Doctors were expected to be honest about their abilities and to refer patients to more skilled practitioners when necessary. Medical knowledge was considered a sacred trust that should be used for the benefit of patients rather than for personal gain. Ancient Egyptian pain management utilized various substances and techniques to reduce suffering during medical procedures and illness. Opium was available but expensive and was reserved for severe pain. Alcohol was commonly used as an anesthetic during minor surgery. Massage, heat therapy, and positioning techniques were used to relieve pain from injuries and chronic conditions. Egyptian medical training required many years of study and practical experience under the supervision of established physicians. Students learned by observing experienced doctors, practicing on less serious cases, and gradually taking on more responsibility. The training process was rigorous, and many students did not complete their medical education successfully. Ancient Egyptian medical costs varied widely depending on the type of treatment required and the patient's ability to pay. Wealthy patients could afford expensive treatments and consultations with the most skilled physicians. Poor patients often relied on temple physicians who provided basic medical care as part of their religious duties. Some treatments were provided free of charge as acts of religious charity. Egyptian medical outcomes were variable and depended on many factors, including the severity of the condition, the skill of the physician, and the availability of appropriate treatments. Many patients recovered from illnesses and injuries that would have been fatal without medical intervention. However, the limitations of ancient medical knowledge meant that many conditions could not be effectively treated and resulted in disability or death. Ancient Egyptian religious ceremonies were elaborate rituals that connected the human world with the divine realm and maintained the cosmic order that Egyptians believed was essential for the continued existence of their civilization. These ceremonies were performed daily in temples throughout Egypt and required the participation of trained priests who understood the complex procedures and religious significance of each ritual act. Egyptian temple architecture was designed to facilitate religious ceremonies and create appropriate settings for encounters between humans and gods. Temples were built as houses for the gods, with successive chambers that became increasingly sacred as one moved toward the inner sanctuary where the god statue was housed. Only the highest-ranking priests were allowed to enter the most sacred areas and perform the most important rituals. Ancient Egyptian daily temple rituals began before dawn when priests performed purification ceremonies that prepared them for contact with the divine. These rituals included bathing in sacred pools, shaving all body hair, and putting on clean linen garments. Priests also had to abstain from certain foods and activities that were considered impure and incompatible with religious service. Egyptian morning temple ceremonies centered around the awakening of the god statue, which was believed to house the actual presence of the deity. The high priest would enter the inner sanctuary, break the clay seal on the shrine, and perform rituals that symbolically awakened the god for the new day. The statue was washed, clothed in fresh garments, and offered food and drink. Ancient Egyptian temple offerings included vast quantities of food, drink, and other valuable items that were presented to the gods throughout each day. These offerings included bread, beer, meat, vegetables, fruits, incense, flowers, and precious objects like jewelry and fine cloth. The offerings were believed to nourish the gods and maintain their favor. Toward Egypt and its people, Egyptian priestly hierarchy was complex and included numerous ranks and specializations that reflected different levels of religious authority and responsibility. The high priest was the most important religious official in each temple and had direct contact with the god statue. Lesser priests performed supporting roles in ceremonies and maintained temple facilities. Some priests specialized in particular aspects of religious practice like music, writing, or astronomical observation. Ancient Egyptian religious festivals occurred throughout the year according to traditional calendars that marked important events in the lives of the gods and the natural cycles that governed Egyptian life. Major festivals could last for many days and involved elaborate processions, special ceremonies, and community celebrations that brought together people from throughout the region. Egyptian religious processions were spectacular, public events that allowed ordinary people to see the god statues and participate in religious ceremonies. The god statue was placed in a special boat-shaped shrine and carried through the streets on the shoulders of priests. These processions often traveled from one temple to another and could cover many miles over several days. Ancient Egyptian religious music was an essential component of temple ceremonies and included singing, chanting, and instrumental performances that were believed to please the gods and enhance the effectiveness of religious rituals. Temple musicians were trained professionals who understood the complex musical requirements of different ceremonies. Musical instruments included harps, flutes, drums, and sistrums. Egyptian religious dance was performed during certain ceremonies and festivals to honor the gods and tell stories about mythological events. Sacred dances were highly stylized performances that required extensive training and practice. Dancers wore special costumes and masks that represented various gods and mythological figures. Some dancers reenacted creation myths and other important religious stories. Ancient Egyptian religious texts were recited during ceremonies and contained the words and formulas that were believed necessary for successful communication with the gods. These texts were written in hieroglyphs on papyrus scrolls and temple walls. Priests had to memorize long passages and recite them perfectly because errors could invalidate the entire ceremony and anger the gods. Egyptian religious calendar coordination required careful attention to astronomical observations and traditional timing that determined when specific ceremonies should be performed. Priests who specialized in astronomy observed the movements of stars, planets, and the moon to calculate proper dates for religious festivals. Mistakes in calendar calculations could have serious consequences for the entire community. Ancient Egyptian ritual purity was essential for anyone who participated in religious ceremonies and required following strict rules about diet, behavior, and personal hygiene. Priests had to avoid certain foods, sexual activity, and contact with dead bodies or other polluting substances. Purification rituals were performed regularly to remove any contamination that might interfere with religious duties. Egyptian temple economics were complex systems that managed the vast resources required to support religious activities and maintain temple facilities. Temples owned large amounts of land, employed thousands of workers, and controlled significant portions of Egypt's wealth. Temple administrators organized agricultural production, manufacturing, and trade that generated income to support religious activities. Ancient Egyptian religious education was provided in temple schools where future priests learned to read and write hieroglyphs, memorize religious texts, and understand the complex procedures required for various ceremonies. Religious education also included instruction in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and other subjects that were considered necessary for religious service. Egyptian religious law governed many aspects of daily life and established rules for proper behavior that maintained harmony between humans and gods. Religious law covered dietary restrictions, sexual behavior, business practices, and social relationships. Violations of religious law were believed to anger the gods and bring misfortune to individuals and communities. Ancient Egyptian religious healing combined medical treatment with religious ceremonies that were believed necessary for complete recovery from illness and injury. Temple physicians performed medical procedures while priests conducted rituals that addressed the spiritual causes of disease. Patients often spent time in temple healing centers where they received both medical and religious treatment. Egyptian religious construction projects required enormous resources and involved entire communities in building and maintaining temples, pyramids, and other religious structures. These projects were considered acts of religious devotion that earned divine favor for everyone involved. Construction work was organized around religious calendars. and often included ceremonies that consecrated each stage of the building process. Ancient Egyptian religious burial practices were elaborate procedures that prepared the deceased for the afterlife and ensured their continued existence in the realm of the gods. These practices included mummification, provision of grave goods, and performance of religious ceremonies that activated the magical properties of burial equipment. Proper burial was considered essential for eternal life. Egyptian religious magic was integrated into temple ceremonies and daily life as a means of influencing divine forces and protecting against harmful supernatural powers. Magical spells and rituals were performed by priests who understood the proper procedures for invoking divine assistance. Magic was considered a legitimate religious practice that complemented prayer and offerings. Ancient Egyptian religious art decorated temples and religious objects with images and symbols that had specific religious meanings and magical properties. Religious artwork was created by skilled craftsmen who understood the religious significance of different colors, symbols, and artistic techniques. This artwork was believed to have actual power rather than being merely decorative. Ancient Egyptian trade networks extended throughout the known world and made Egypt one of the wealthiest and most influential civilizations of the ancient era. Egyptian merchants traveled by land and sea to exchange goods that could not be produced locally, establishing commercial relationships that brought exotic materials and foreign influences into Egyptian society while spreading Egyptian culture to distant lands. Egyptian Nile River commerce was the foundation of the country's trade system and provided an efficient transportation network that connected Upper and Lower Egypt. Boats of various sizes carried goods along the river, taking advantage of prevailing winds and currents that made travel relatively easy and inexpensive. The Nile served as Egypt's main highway and enabled the development of a unified national economy. Ancient Egyptian boat construction utilized techniques that had been developed over thousands of years and produced vessels that were well suited to Nile River conditions. Most boats were made from papyrus reeds that were bound together to create lightweight, flexible craft that could navigate shallow waters and carry substantial loads. Wooden boats were more expensive but more durable and were used for long-distance trade and military purposes. Egyptian river navigation required extensive knowledge of seasonal water levels, current patterns, and hazards that could damage boats or endanger crews. Experienced navigators understood how to read the river and adjust their routes according to changing conditions. Navigation was particularly challenging during flood season, when familiar landmarks were submerged and new channels appeared. Ancient Egyptian port facilities were built at strategic locations along the Nile and Mediterranean coasts to handle the loading and unloading of goods, storage of merchandise, and servicing of boats. These facilities included docks, warehouses, workshops, and administrative buildings. Port towns became centers of commerce and cultural exchange where merchants from different regions met to conduct business. Egyptian trade goods included both raw materials and finished products that were valued throughout the ancient world. Egypt exported grain, gold, papyrus, linen, and stone while importing wood, metals, spices, incense, and exotic animals. The balance of trade was generally favorable to Egypt because of the country's agricultural productivity and the high quality of Egyptian manufactured goods. Ancient Egyptian gold mining was concentrated in the eastern desert, where Extensive mining operations extracted gold from quartz veins in hard rock formations. Gold mining was dangerous work performed mainly by prisoners and slaves who worked in extremely harsh conditions. The gold mines were heavily guarded because gold was essential for Egypt's international trade and domestic economy. Egyptian papyrus production was a major industry that supplied writing material for Egypt and export markets throughout the Mediterranean region. Papyrus was made from reeds that grew in marshes along the Nile River. The manufacturing process involved cutting reeds into strips, arranging them in crossing patterns, and pressing them together to form smooth sheets suitable for writing. Ancient Egyptian textile manufacturing produced high linen that was prized throughout the ancient world for its fineness and durability. Egyptian linen was made from flax plants that were grown in the fertile Nile Valley and processed using techniques that had been refined over many centuries. The finest linen was almost transparent and was reserved for religious ceremonies and royal garments. Egyptian stone quarrying supplied building materials for domestic construction projects and export markets that valued Egyptian granite, limestone, and sandstone. Quarrying operations were located throughout Egypt and employed thousands of workers who extracted stone blocks using copper tools, wooden wedges, and manual labor. Transportation of heavy stone blocks required specialized equipment and techniques. Ancient Egyptian craftsmanship produced luxury goods that were sought after by wealthy customers throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Egyptian craftsmen were skilled in working with gold, silver, precious stones, ivory, and exotic woods to create jewelry, furniture, decorative objects, and religious artifacts. These luxury goods commanded high prices in international markets. Egyptian merchant organizations were necessary to coordinate complex trading operations that involved multiple parties, various types of goods, and long-distance transportation. Merchants formed partnerships to share risks and pool resources for large trading ventures. Trade associations established standards for quality, weights, and measures that facilitated commercial transactions. Ancient Egyptian banking services supported trade by providing credit, currency exchange, and money transfers that enabled merchants to conduct business across long distances and between different economic systems. Bankers charged fees for their services and made profits by lending money at interest. Banking was risky because there was no government insurance to protect depositors. Egyptian trade routes connected Egypt with Africa, Asia, and Europe through both overland and maritime networks. Overland routes crossed the Sinai Peninsula to reach Palestine and Syria. Maritime routes connected Egyptian ports with trading centers throughout the Mediterranean Sea and Red Sea. Some Egyptian merchants traveled as far as India and East Africa. Ancient Egyptian diplomatic trade involved exchanges of gifts between Egypt and foreign rulers that served both commercial and political purposes. These diplomatic missions carried valuable goods that demonstrated Egypt's wealth and power while establishing relationships that facilitated regular commercial trade. Diplomatic trade was often more valuable than ordinary commercial transactions. Egyptian trade regulation was administered by government officials who collected customs duties, inspected goods for quality and safety, and maintained records of commercial transactions. Trade regulations were designed to protect Egyptian consumers, ensure fair business practices, and generate revenue for the government. Violations of trade regulations could result in fines or Confiscation of goods. Ancient Egyptian market systems included both local markets that served daily needs and regional markets that handled long-distance trade. Local markets were held regularly in towns and villages and featured goods produced by local farmers and craftsmen. Regional markets were larger events that attracted merchants from distant areas and featured more exotic and expensive goods. Egyptian currency systems evolved over time from simple barter arrangements to more sophisticated monetary systems that used standardized weights of precious metals as units of exchange. Silver and gold were used for large transactions, while copper was used for smaller purchases. Grain was also used as a form of currency, especially for paying wages and taxes. Ancient Egyptian contract law governed commercial transactions and provided legal frameworks for resolving disputes between merchants, customers, and other parties involved in trade. Contracts were usually written on papyrus and witnessed by neutral parties. Legal procedures existed for enforcing contracts and collecting debts, although the effectiveness of these procedures varied depending on the wealth and social status of the parties involved. Egyptian trade guilds were professional organizations that regulated various crafts and trades, maintained quality standards, and protected the interests of their members. Guilds controlled who could practice particular trades, set prices for goods and services, and provided training for new craftsmen. Guild membership was often hereditary and created tight-knit communities of related families. Ancient Egyptian seasonal trade patterns were influenced by Nile flood cycles, weather conditions, and agricultural seasons that determined when various goods were available and when transportation was possible. Trade activity was highest during the dry season, when river navigation was easier and roads were passable. Some goods were available only at certain times of year and commanded premium prices when supplies were limited. Egyptian trade security was a constant concern because merchants faced threats from bandits, pirates, and hostile foreign powers. Merchant caravans traveled in groups for protection and sometimes hired guards to protect valuable goods. The Egyptian government maintained military forces to protect trade routes and conducted diplomatic negotiations to ensure safe passage for Egyptian merchants.